Hello and welcome to episode 57 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my toothpick. And I'm going to be clinging to this toothpick throughout this episode, I think, because I was given pork ribs for dinner. And when you eat pork, Ajahn Chah talks about this even. When you eat pork, it's like little pieces of pork get stuck between your teeth, and you can just feel it, and it takes forever to get them out sometimes. So this is here, and this is my beverage, which also can help bovine glandular secretions, don't you know? Ah. And I have the veritable shit ton of questions today. People have been very curious and inquisitive over the past week. And so we've got a boatload, you might say. I mean, we got more questions today than you can shake a stick at. In fact, the number of sticks required to shake at all these questions would be more than you could shake a stick at. So I suppose, instead of lame attempts at humor, I should just start answering questions. God, they just get in there, you know? So anyway, the very first question is one that I forgot to ask last time. Sometimes it's like my scrolling fingers are just too muscular or something, and I just shoot past a question as I'm scrolling down. And so this one was asked by Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana last time, and I just overlooked it. I just skipped over it accidentally. Wasn't intentional, I guarantee you. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, can you explain the difference between the Nibbana element with remainder and without remainder? Because it says Nibbana element with remainder means that the Arahant experiences everything that is pleasurable and painful, but does not have greed, hatred, and delusion. Does that mean to experience the full Nibbana element, they have to be in some kind of meditative state? Is there a name for when an Arahant that has experienced this full Nibbana is beyond everything, like a name for this state? Is there a name for when an Arahant that is experiencing this full Nibbana that's beyond everything, like a name for this state? I'll try to refrain from being a grammar Nazi on this one. Also, why is the normal walking around experience of an Arahant also called Nibbana? Well, this is kind of a complicated question, actually. The difference between Nibbana element with remainder and without remainder is essentially you've got someone who becomes enlightened, then they're enlightened, but they still have like the residue of karma, and they still have mental states going on. And the Nibbana element without remainder is after the enlightened being dies. So it'd be like Parinibbana. And this part of the question anyway reminds me of the last few verses of the Kalahawiwada Sutta, of the Atthaka Wagga of the Sutta Nipata, which just through mere chance I happen to have right here. And so there's the very famous koan-like description of an enlightened mental state, which the commentarial tradition says is not a description of an enlightened mental state, but the context of the sutta makes it clear that it is, where the Buddha says, with regard to the enlightened being, he has no perception of perception, he has no perception of non-perception, he is not without perception, he has no perception of void. For one who has attained thus, form becomes void, for founded in perception is diversifying designation, or papancha sankha. So then the person he's talking to says, that which we asked you have related to us. Let us ask you something more. Please tell us this. Do indeed some intelligent ones here declare that the highest purity of the spirit is to that extent, or do they declare that it is even more than that? So he's asking, if there's a higher state even than this state of enlightenment that the Buddha just explained in this strange, riddle-like way, and which the commentaries say he's not even trying to explain enlightenment, even though obviously the context implies that he is. So then the Buddha says, indeed, some intelligent ones here do declare that the highest purity of the spirit is to that extent, but then some of them, claiming to be adepts, declare an attainment in which nothing that was taken up remains. So that's like, all of the past karma is just completely exhausted. There's no more stuff coming up, which presumably would mean that the person is dead. And then he says, so having understood these to be dependent, the sage, an investigator, having understood the ways of dependence, a released one, having understood, does not come to contention. The wise one does not attain to this or that existence. So one problem with me answering this question is I have to answer it twice, once in accordance with Orthodox tradition, and then once in accordance with my best understanding, based upon my own experience and my own attempts at making sense of what the texts say. Because I have to admit, Abhidhamma and the commentarial traditions really do not do a very good job of that, in my opinion. So let's see here. He says, can you explain the difference between Nibbana element with remainder and without remainder? One, without remainder means you're dead. The enlightened being is dead. With remainder means the enlightened being is still alive, as a general rule. Because it says Nibbana element with remainder means that the Arhat experiences everything that is pleasurable and painful, but does not have greed, hatred, and delusion. Does that mean to experience the full Nibbana element, they have to be in some kind of meditative state? Well, according to Orthodox tradition, even an enlightened being isn't in a state of Nibbana all the time. He goes into a meditative state and then he experiences Nibbana for like a trillionth of a second. But he can do that whenever he feels like it. But still, it really is not compatible with what texts like the Kalahariwada Sutta say, because that koan-like definition of the enlightened mind is presumably continuous. You're always in a state of Nibbana, and that would be my interpretation also, that an enlightened being isn't just experiencing Nibbana in like momentary flashes when he decides that he wants to experience Nibbana, or when he just is appropriate for him to experience it, but rather, he's just always in that state because he has transmuted perception into its underlying essence of reality. So let's see, is there a name for when an Arhat that is experiencing this full Nibbana that's beyond everything, like a name for this state? Also, why is the normal walking around experience of an Arhat also called Nibbana? Well, in older texts maybe, and according to my understanding, like I just said, the Arahant is his mind will be in a state of Nibbana because he is directly experiencing ultimate reality. He's still going through the motions, but it's so hard to explain this. Maybe I should have answered this question last time, so it wouldn't be the very first one on the list this time. Because again, you're having to deal with this paradoxical state. Like the Mahayana Buddhists say that Nirvana and samsara are ultimately the same. It's sort of like Nirvana is the essence of reality, and like samsara is just the forms that this essence assumes or seems to assume. So whether I've answered this second half of this question or not, I'm not exactly sure. Because again, to further complicate matters, the Orthodox tradition says one thing and I say something else. And you can just take your pick. So let's see. Is there a name for when an Arhat is experiencing this full Nibbana that's beyond everything, like a name for this state? Yeah, the grammar kind of throws me off because I can be a grammar Nazi at times. But yeah, according to Orthodox tradition, the state that I think he's referring to, it'd just be like the state of being an enlightened being. I guess, just being an Arahant. That would be it, I suppose. So I think I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's next question, because as I say, I've got the proverbial shit ton of questions here. So he says, does the Buddha ever teach Nibbana as the ultimate reality? Well, the Buddha, he tried to avoid teaching Nibbana as anything. That's one thing that the Buddhists, the early Buddhists especially, and to some degree the Majjhimaka Buddhists afterwards, were really good at just not reifying Nibbana. Abhidhamma turned it into just one of many ultimate realities, which is ridiculous in my opinion. But I mean, there's implications that it is. Like in the Atthakavagga, there's just one truth and not another, that sort of a thing. So, I mean, the one truth would presumably be the ultimate reality. Um, but Nibbana, I mean, talking about Nibbana is difficult. I mean, just because human languages aren't designed to talk about what is off the scale, what is, they're not designed to talk about the Kantian thing in itself. Their languages were designed to talk about, what you want for dinner and, where the hospital is and, this worldly, practical, material stuff and, or feelings, my knee itches or something. And so, I mean, it is good to bear in mind that there are two aspects of Nirvana, even though Nirvana is ultimate reality. But I mean, there's two approaches to it. One is metaphysical, like when Abhidhamma says, Nibbana is an ultimate reality. And two is ethical, the attaining of enlightenment would be also Nibbana. In fact, Nibbana is almost a verb. It's like a verbal noun. It means blowing out. Ni is out, and Nibbana is Nirvana, like Nirvana is blowing out. So it's like a fire blowing out, which, I mean, it's so hard to talk about. It really is. Because if Nibbana were just the principle of cessation, which is like an orthodox definition of Nibbana, then, I mean, cessation lasts one moment at most. And I mean, it can't be like constantly ceasing. It just ceases and that's it. Samsara, I mean, or greed, hate, and delusion, or suffering, or whatever it is that you are bringing an end to when you become enlightened. So there is implications of Nibbana as ultimate reality, but he doesn't just flat out say it, because the Buddha doesn't really flat out say much of anything about Nibbana, especially in the earlier texts. Later texts, they'll start talking about it more, and then you get into Mahayana Buddhism, and they're talking about it more. But I think in the beginning, the Buddha was very scrupulous about not reifying Nibbana. That, I mean, if he would talk about Nibbana at all, it would be, the state of blowing out, the state of becoming enlightened, which itself would not be well defined because you can't define it very well anyway. So, yeah, it is implied, but I mean, really, Nibbana is not equated with anything else, really. So I think I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipat Zidana's questions, and his next question. And he's been asking some subtle and difficult questions lately. And I mean, mainly it's difficult to just put an answer into words, because as I say, Nirvana is just off the scale. It is not in samsara. It is not part of samsara. So the next question is, you say there was probably no perfect sages, but what about the Buddha? He seems like the perfect sage to me, with wisdom greater than all that have ever lived. Sure, he probably wasn't omniscient, but nothing makes me doubt his enlightenment. Meanwhile, the same can't be said about most of these Hindu gurus, who are practically advocating nothing different than the devotionalism of other religions and don't even have control of their emotions or what's in their pants. Well, I mean, the Buddha says even nobody has complete control over their emotions or of their body. I mean, that's one of the signs of no self. Like the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, supposedly the Buddha's second discourse after his enlightenment, that caused his first disciples to become fully enlightened. He's saying you just do not have complete control. You cannot say with regard to any of the five khandhas, let it be this way and let it not be that way, and have it consistently happen, because you're really not in control of that. So it's more a matter of mindfulness of what arises rather than controlling what arises. So let's see. You say there are probably no perfect sages, but what about the Buddha? Well, we don't know what the Buddha was really like. I mean, I'm reminded of one of the early Christian saints, I think it was Saint Benedict, where he wrote an autobiography and he confessed that he enjoyed talking to young women more than he enjoyed talking to old women. And his followers, the Benedictines, consider that to be too scandalously honest. He was too admitting like what could be considered a fault about himself, and so that was edited out of Saint Benedict's autobiography for centuries. And I think the Buddha was somewhat similar, or he could have been. The man lived 25 centuries ago. We don't know exactly what he was like any more than we know exactly what Socrates was like. Socrates is a fairly good example, or a good comparison, because we have some fairly solid ideas about who Socrates was and where he lived and when he lived and what he was like to some degree. But then you have people like Plato and Xenophon who are describing Socrates, and Plato and Xenophon, there are two main sources of information about Socrates, and they're describing essentially two different people. I mean, there's overlap, but I mean, they were definitely not the same guy that they were describing. And even in ancient times, they knew that most of what Plato was said by Socrates was really just Plato's words coming out of sort of a fictionalized Socrates' mouth. And so the early Buddhists, they were very keen on honoring and glorifying their teacher. And so anything that the Buddha did, like maybe he cracked a joke every now and then, maybe he laughed even. But nowadays, or even, relatively early on, they're saying that a fully enlightened being cannot laugh or cry, which I'm skeptical of. So, the Buddha was a sage, but the thing is, from a samsaric point of view, there's always going to be quirks you can criticize. He abandoned his wife and child, that's this sort of thing. Or the comment he made about the pretty young woman who, what is this full of urine and dung? I would not want to touch it even with my foot. You can read the biographies of saints and sages. And I mean, if you have got like a cynical eye, or you're just looking for scandal, you can find it. You can find dirt, and you can just fling it if you want. And I mean, the same could be done with the Buddha, even with his biographies sanitized and like glorified. Still, I mean, there's stuff you can find fault with if you really want to find fault with something. And I'm sure there's a lot of non-Buddhists, for example, who have taken like religions of the world and like classes in world religions or something, and then they can read this stuff about the Buddha, and then they can just like pick out this stuff, and it's like, there you see, he wasn't an enlightened being, he was a huckster or whatever. So I really do think it's sort of like the first question, where of Siovaksha and Sipat Zidana, where it's like you still have these, at the samsaric level, you still have all these human quirks and human foibles and so forth, because you're human. But it's not that you have completely gone beyond that, like in a samsaric sense. You've just transcended it. You're not identified with that anymore. That's not you. I mean, you don't consider it to be you anymore. It's just nature taking its course. That's what true wisdom is. It's not like completely controlling your behavior so that you behave in a perfectly saintly manner all the time. It's that you are mindful of what is arising, and you're not identifying with it at all. You're not clinging to it. It's just nature taking its course. And because of a lot of spiritual practice to get you to that state, you've got good habits set in. There are certain things that are pretty easy to do because you have been resisting the urge to do it for years and years, and you've been mindful of the urges, and they've been weakened through not feeding them, not reinforcing them. So an enlightened being will be more saintly in his behavior than the average guy, but still, I mean, if you want to find fault, you can find fault. It's still, I mean, their behavior is still samsaric, because that behavior is a samsaric phenomenon. So let's see here. Meanwhile, the same can't be said about most of those Hindu gurus who are practically advocating nothing different than devotionalism. Neem Karoli Baba, his picture's up there. He worshipped Hanuman, the monkey god. But, I mean, miracles just happened around him. Like, it was almost a commonplace. And he would look at you and he would see right through you. And like Ram Dass used to say, the better you knew him, the more you realized there was nobody there. He was just like a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you. And if you had rascally karma, you'd have rascally karma reflected back at you. So, I mean, it's not so much thinking the right stuff and saying the right stuff. You don't have to be a sophisticated philosopher to be enlightened. You just have to be detached, mindful and detached. And then whatever comes up as a result of cultural conditioning or past karma or whatever, it's just nature taking its course and you're not involved in that. You know, it's just, that's not you anymore. You don't identify with it. It's just, I mean, you're just detached. So I think I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's next question here. In the story of the kid, how did his mother renounce if the Theravada nun order died out? And the beating he got sounds brutal. I bet he wished he was never found by that monk. Maybe that's when he truly comprehended dukkha and realized cessation is better than samsara. Well, this is from, I think it was the previous Q&A where I was talking about this little kid whose mother was a nun. She became a nun after she had the kid, and she didn't want to have to raise a kid as a nun. So she just figured, I mean, she was very religious, apparently. She just wanted him to become a monk, so she sent him to a monastery. This little kid who just wanted to be a little kid. I think his name was Ponandana. That was his pothudo, his like, it's like a pre-novice. They wore white robes and shaved their head, but they could still handle money and so forth. And yeah, he ran away because he just wanted to be a kid, you know. And finally, the senior monk who was, responsible for him found him. I mean, he was out searching for him day after day for like 2 weeks until he finally found him dressed in rags, living in this tea shop. And he brought him back to the monastery, and then they sent him to the nunnery where his mother was. And the mother superior just gave him a really, really hard beating. And I guess the question here is that how did his mother renounce if the Theravada nun order died out? It's because she wasn't a fully ordained bhikkhuni. She was what is called in Burma a Thila Shin, which is an 8 precept or 10 precept nun. There are lots of those. I can't remember I think they're called Machi in Thailand, where they mostly wear white, I think. So even though the fully ordained nuns went extinct centuries ago, although there have been attempts to revive them, mainly for like politically correct gender equality and so forth. But still, there are nuns. They're just not fully ordained, and they generally keep, only like 8 or 10 precepts, plus what you might call extra precepts of just, the uniform and the shaved head and all that. So let's see. So that's the main question here. That's the only question mark. How did his mother renounce if the Theravada nun order died out? Well, there's still unordained nuns or semi-ordained Thila Shins. So let's see. The beating he's got sounds brutal. I bet he wished he was never found by the monk. Well, when he was getting beaten, I assumed he wished he was never found by the monk. But I assume he gradually, he reconciled himself to it and realized that he was better off not living like a hobo under a bridge or, in a tea shop where he's still dressed in rags and so forth. Eventually things got better for him, I assume. So I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's next question, which is, I would personally never ordain because I want to be there for my parents. How did you come to terms when your own parents passed away and you weren't there in their time of need? I would have lived with regret my whole life. And then this comment was under the in the comments of the previous Q&A, and then someone replied to his comment by saying, a very timely and pertinent question when Western and East Asian societies are experiencing declining birth rates, aging populations, and the inversion of demographic pyramids. So I guess the main question here is, let's see, how did I become, that is, how did I come to terms when my own parents passed away and I weren't there in their time of need? Well, I mean, and then he says he would have lived with regret his whole life. Well, one thing that I've learned, I mean, I really have taken this to heart, and it's one of the most important things a Buddhist should realize, is that regret is always bad karma. In Pali, it's called kukucha. It is unskillful. It's akusala karma. It always makes things worse. So if you do something wrong, to acknowledge you did something wrong and do what you can, if possible, to rectify your wrong, that's fine. You know, to acknowledge you did something wrong and to like determine that you will try to do better in the future, that's completely fine. But to feel regret and remorse just makes things worse. It's just bad karma. You shouldn't do it. So I've taken that to heart. And I mean, sometimes it makes me seem kind of inhuman, I suppose. People have gotten upset with me more than once because of that. But still, I mean, it's just the way it is. Regret, remorse is bad karma. From a Buddhist point of view, don't do it. And it's just, I've become almost immune to regret. I think it would have been nice if I could have been a better son to my mother, especially. My father had a good pension. He had a wife who adored him. He was taken care of. You know, I didn't have to worry so much about him. My mother, on the other hand, made lots of mistakes in her life. And yeah, I mean, she did not have a happy, serene old age, other than just when she's on the couch watching TV or something. And yeah, it would have been nice if I could have been a better son to her. And I was in Burma when both of my parents died. So, I mean, yeah. Let's see. Okay, so I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the Spanish Inquisition. And this also he asked more than a week ago, I think, but he asked it in an older Q&A. And then when I'm going through the previous Q&A, like, you know, compiling questions for the list, I didn't see it because it was in the Q&A before that. I mean, he asked the question like after I'd already done the Q&A after that, so I didn't see it. So anyway, the Spanish Inquisition says, in meditation, are you supposed to actually say in your mind, that's long breath or short breath, or breathing in, breathing out, or just observing those without thinking these words? Well, I have to admit, like in the Satipatthana Sutta and in the Anapana Sutta, it says, you know, when you breathe in, you know, I am breathing in, and when you're breathing out, you know, I'm breathing out. When you're breathing in a long breath, you know, I'm breathing in a long breath. When you're breathing in a short breath, you know, I'm breathing in a short breath, etc. And that is just a heck of a lot of thinking, and you're never going to get any kind of deep meditative states. You're never going to get into deep meditation if you're just thinking like in sentences like this. You know, I'm breathing in long, I'm breathing in short. So I think it was a lack of sophistication in communication skills to some degree when they were composing this. I'm not exactly sure why they did it, but it's not the best advice. I mean, really, they should say, when you breathe in long, you know you're breathing in long. When you breathe in short, you know you're breathing in short. When you're breathing in fast, you know you're breathing in fast. Breathe in slow, you know you're breathing in slow. I mean, essentially what it's saying is, you know the qualities of the breath. So, yeah, you're better off not thinking in terms of, I'm breathing in long, that this is a short breath, this is a long breath, anything like that. For relative beginners up until like intermediate levels, I mean, you can say breathing in, breathing out. I mean, if if your mind is still active enough that you need some kind of busy work to keep it occupied so it's not just drifting or floating all over the place, just drifting away from meditation. It's like if you've got an active mind, you need an active meditation to keep the active mind occupied. And then as the mind settles down, then you get a more settled, quieter, calmer kind of meditation. Because, if you just stick to breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, you're never going to get past words. Unless maybe you just start being mindful of the thought, the words themselves, as perceptions or thoughts or whatever, without really paying attention to the content. You generally start off labeling, but even breathing in long, breathing in short, that's excessive labeling, in my opinion. Even beginners really, generally they're not instructed to do that. Just breathing in, breathing out. And then, you use that almost as a mantra, just a way of occupying your mind and keeping it from drifting away from the primary object, which is the breath of the nostrils, as a general rule. So, I'm getting all complicated on this relatively simple question here. So I'll just read it again. In meditation, are you supposed to actually say in your mind, that's long breath, short breath, breathing in, breathing out, or just observing those without thinking these words? Okay. Breathing in, breathing out would be like the beginning level. Anything more than that would be excessive, unless you really have a hyperactive mind and you need to just label everything, especially at first, until your mind settles down. But once your mind settles down enough, then you dispense with all labels and you just watch the phenomenon. You're just aware of it. So I'll just move on to the Spanish Inquisition, the next question. Okay. He has asked me to show a postcard behind me on the bookshelf. Just a minute. Let's see here. Right there. Okay. And the Spanish Inquisition's next question is, and please can you, for the next Q&A, put my postcard somewhere behind you on the bookshelf or wherever. And as it turns out, it's right there. Next question. It's a very nice postcard too, by the way. Next question. There are some rules that came of basically monks having too much or maybe too expensive stuff. Deliberately cutting and sewing robes is a good example. What is your take on monks having laptops and iPhones, while maybe in the next village in rural Burma or Thailand, some honest working man may look at those monks and think, those bhikkhus are more wealthy than we are. I suspect that if the Buddha lived today, he would allow socks or warm clothes from monks, but he would, and I'm almost sure of this, not allow $1,000 iPhones or laptops and smoking cigarettes. So let's see. What is your take on monks having laptops and iPhones? Well, it's even more than that. Like in Burma, a lot of monks, literally the word bhikkhu means beggar. Bhikkam bhikkhati bhikkhu. He begs for alms. Therefore he is a bhikkhu. And still, these beggars, these humble beggars going barefoot silently through the village with their alms bowl, they'll have servants with them. And back at the monastery, they got servants, they got attendants attending to their needs and so forth, which is more than the average subsistence farmer can afford, and it always made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't like having servants. I'd send them, like, there were a few times when a servant's wanting to come along and carry the heavy stuff or something. I just say, no, man, it's just embarrassing for a beggar to have a servant. But let's see, with regard to, and then so it's sort of this weird tug of war. On the one hand, the suttas themselves say a monk should have 8 requisites, just as little stuff as he can, he can just carry it around with him. Everything he owns, he can just pick it up, put it on his back and just start walking. But like in a place like Burma or just about any devoutly Buddhist country, people consider monks to be exalted beings. They're holy men, and you get merit from offering them stuff. And it makes them feel bad if they see a monk who's doesn't have a servant, or he's just got crappy stuff, just cheap, bottom of the line stuff. It makes them feel like they're not supporting him enough. They're not, it's like they're getting demerit from letting this monk, make do with, the second rate stuff. And so it's like the strictest monks are the ones that people want to spoil rotten the most, because they get the most merit for helping like the really saintly monks. I mean, if you're helping a rascal, lax, sloppy monk, you still get merit. But if you're helping a saint, you get way more merit for that. And so they're trying to like feed them the best food and give them the best stuff. And they just consider that to be proper. Although the non-Buddhists, or the lukewarm, skeptical, cynical types will say, yeah, look at these monks, they live like kings and they don't have to do anything. So, I mean, it goes both ways. With regard to monks having laptops and iPhones, let's see, maybe my last 10 years as a monk, I did have a laptop. It was the first laptop I ever owned. I got after I've been a monk for 20 years or so. And it's very useful. I mean, instead of carrying around an entire bookcase, like the entire Pali Tipitaka, you can just have it all on the computer, and there's no way you could carry an entire Pali Tipitaka around with you. In Burma, in the Burmese edition, it's 40 volumes. Like the blue, like after the very first book on the top shelf there, which is the Pali English Dictionary, there's several books after that that are part of the Pali Tipitaka, the Burmese Pali Tipitaka, and it's just 40 of those size of books. And you just couldn't carry them around with you, but on a computer you can. It does have certain advantages, but still, I mean, it's this weird situation where probably, yeah, like if the Buddha were alive and he were still like an ancient Indian, yeah, he'd say just none of that's necessary. Just sit under a tree with few possessions. But nowadays, I mean, it's communication and everything. It's kind of a problematic situation. And the iPhones, yeah, I had a crappy Huawei when I was in Burma. Let's see. That was just my last few years as a monk also. I just used it mainly as an alarm clock and a Wi-Fi hotspot. So let's see. Yeah, if the Buddha lived today, let's see, he would allow socks or warm clothes for monks, but he would, and I'm almost sure of this, not allow $1,000 iPhones or laptops and smoking cigarettes. Yeah, smoking cigarettes. That's a big deal in Thailand, especially because probably the most famous arahant or monk considered to have been an arahant in Thailand is Ajahn Mun. He was like the founder of the Thai forest tradition, or considered to be the founder by many people. He was considered to be an arahant, and he smoked cigarettes. He was a chain smoker, in fact. So he was a drug addict. And also he ate cheese in the afternoon and so forth. So Thai monks, I mean, if Ajahn Mun did it and he was an arahant, and then smoking cigarettes and eating cheese in the afternoon is a-okay. But I mean, literally, tobacco is an addictive drug, and since a monk is trying to free himself from all attachments, then obviously you don't take addictive drugs if you can help it. So yeah, I think for the most part, I'm not sure about allowing socks or warm clothes unless it's in an area where it really gets below freezing. Because it got down to freezing in the Ganges Valley, and that was when the Buddha said 3 robes are enough, no socks, anything like that. People were just tougher back then, I guess, monks especially. So I'll just move on to the Spanish Inquisition's next and last question here. If one joined the monk sangha because his parents force him to, would the ordination be valid? Is it valid for children? I have forgotten what is the minimal age for a boy or man to ordain. Well, that's 2 questions. So the first one is, if you're if one joins the sangha because your parents just force you into it, yeah, it's the ordination is still valid. Um, the ordination at the ordination, I mean, it does say that it's against the rules to ordain a monk if his parents don't give their consent. Although the ordination is still valid, it's just that the monks who do the ceremony, they commit a minor offense requiring confession. But so long as he sits through the ceremony and he's got all the qualifications that are requisite, then yeah, it's a valid ordination. And with regard to the minimum age to be ordained as a monk, it would be 20 years from conception. So that'd be like 19 years and 3 months. I think in the Pali tradition, they go with 10 lunar months as the period of pregnancy in a woman. With regard to novices, you can be ordained as a novice. I think there's this obscure statement in the text that says if a boy is old enough to scare crows, then he's old enough to be a novice. And to scare crows, that'd be like a job for a kid to be guarding the fields, right before harvest time to keep them from being raped by birds. He'll be standing there, alert enough and vigilant enough that he can keep the flocks of crows or sparrows or whatever from raping the fields before harvest time. Although I've seen very small kids get ordained as novices. It's kind of interesting that the reason why the Buddha made the rule saying that you have to be at least 20 years old to be ordained, according to the texts, according to tradition, is that before that, you're not emotionally mature enough to withstand the taunts and abuse of non-Buddhists who are like making fun of you and calling you a skinhead and so forth. Because that did happen in the Buddhist time. Obviously, in the Buddhist time, India was not predominantly Buddhist. In fact, there were lots of spiritual teachers who were more popular and famous than the Buddha was during his lifetime. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Arain. And Arain says, how does one overcome the language barrier when learning Buddhism in the West? So many terms are in Pali or Sanskrit that it turns some people away. Well, I mean, we're kind of stuck with that. I mean, in Christianity, everything's been translated in English in English-speaking countries. They don't really go with like much Greek or Hebrew. There's a few words like agape, that kind of a thing. Like Christ itself is, well, it's an English version of Christos or Christos. So, yeah, but in Theravada Buddhism, there's a lot of Pali terms. So how does one overcome the language barrier when learning Buddhism? Well, one thing, you can get just a Buddhist dictionary, Jnanatiloka's Buddhist dictionary. It's for free distribution from some places. Some charitable organizations just distribute it for free. But I think we're pretty much stuck with a lot of Pali terms, which in the long run is a good thing. I mean, once you learn the meaning of it, it's much better than relying on English translations that may not be the best translation, like the term asawa. If you're familiar with the term asawa, you can get a pretty good idea of what it's referring to. But in English, you've got like Bhikkhu Bodhi refers to it as taints. In some old translations, it's cankers. There's all these different translations. I render it as encumbering influence. Or sometimes, like Ajahn Tanisaro, he's got his own set of renderings. He just does not follow established tradition with regard to even stuff like mindfulness. So he'll have his own unique terms. And if you're not familiar with Pali, you don't know what the Pali equivalent is of what he's talking about sometimes. So it is good. I mean, if you're serious about studying Theravada Buddhism, it is good to familiarize yourself with at least, the top 20 or 50 Pali terms, like the philosophical terms. And I mean, if you're really serious, you would do well to just learn Pali so you can read the text in the original Pali. So how does one overcome the language barrier when learning Buddhism in the West? rely on English translations, like Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations. He doesn't leave very many words untranslated, and then a lot of technical terms he'll have endnotes or footnotes or something, just explaining them, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's Theravada Buddhism. This is one of the reasons why Theravada appeals more to educated intellectual types than mill workers, for example, hairdressers, because I mean it does take a certain amount of intelligence and study to really get the jargon down, get the terminology down, so that you can understand, what it is that you're studying, what it is that you're reading, and so forth. So I'm sorry. I mean, there's the best way to overcome the language barrier is just read books like introductory books into Theravada, which will gradually teach you, what kama is and what dhamma is, and what asawa is and what khandhas are, and dukkha, this kind of a thing. And gradually, just through osmosis, you'll pick it up. But it can be kind of daunting at first. But it's well worth it. I mean, if you're interested in Theravada, then it is worth your while to familiarize yourself with, a few dozen Pali terms at least. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from the Arya Swasti Project. And this is kind of a subtle one. And the Arya Swasti Project says, regarding the nauseating "we are all one" that we constantly hear from the left, and the idea that we as Buddhists are trying to expand our consciousness into the not nauseating "all is one." Both ideas sound the same but are wildly different. Can you share your thoughts on how we can all be one and not be one at the same time? Please excuse my misunderstanding of both these topics. Well, personally, I really haven't been encountering leftists saying we are all one very often, because they're the ones who are dividing everybody up in different groups. They're emphasizing differences now. Identity politics has really thrown a monkey wrench into the "we are all one" narrative that might have been a big deal like 20, 30, 40 years ago. But now it's, whitey is evil, conservatives are Nazis. They're not one with us. They should just be, put in concentration camps or gotten rid of somehow or other, indoctrinate their children, so at least their children will grow up to be good leftists. So yeah, the whole idea of "we are all one" has pretty much collapsed in the left, because they are emphasizing identity politics and just division, dividing everybody up into groups. And there you got oppressor groups and oppressed groups. The oppressor groups being mostly white men, and oppressed groups being pretty much everybody else. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, there is still a significant number of leftists, like let's say they're not very political, who are saying we are all one. Yeah, they're probably still operating on a samsaric level. I mean, there's going to be wise leftists who are just very naive with regard to politics, perhaps, who they're wise, they've got wisdom. And so they could say we are all one. I mean, they might mean it at a metaphysical level, sort of like the second interpretation of "we are one" or "we are all one" is, I mean, ultimately at a level of ultimate reality, there is no division into this and that, or much less categories or groups. It's just everything is undivided. You've got just infinite, formless consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, God, whatever. You want to say it's all God, like Neem Karoli Baba, one of his mottos is "Sab Ishwar Hai." It's all God. And that's how everything is one. It's all united in ultimate reality. But if you've got some person who's not particularly wise saying we are all one, they might be emphasizing, like compassion, the heart chakra or something, which is not bad, but it's not off the scale yet. And so there's a certain amount of delusion still involved. And if they're saying that while like still committed to identity politics, then they're just confused or hypocritical. So How we can all be one and not be one at the same time. Well, we're all one at the level of ultimate reality, but here at the samsaric level, we're obviously not all one. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Lieberlam. I don't know how to pronounce some of these names. Lieberlam. Maybe he's Japanese or something. No, that'd be Lieberlam. Okay, anyway. He says, a mentor and close friend of mine is a shaman. A unique point he has made, one I found especially dharmic, is the relationship between the words shaman and shramana. In the context of the natural wisdom of the Buddha, him attaining mastery largely on his own as a pioneer seems very similar to the way of practice of my shaman friend. He speaks of nature as the ultimate teacher of dharma and causality of a spiritual variety. Would you consider a translation like this valid? And then he's got Sanskrit here. Ye dharma hetu prabhava hetum desham tatagato hyavadat desham cha yo nirodha evam vadi mahashramana. And then he's got the translation of that as, of those phenomena which arise from causes, those causes have been taught by the Tathagata, and their cessation too thus proclaims the great shaman. And if I remember correctly, this is a Sanskrit version of the words that converted, who was it, Mahamoggallana or Sariputta, one of the two chief disciples of the Buddha, converted him to Buddhism. That originally both of them were disciples of a different teacher, and they saw one of the monks' one of the Buddha's first disciples going for alms, and he looked so serene, his face is just shining. And so he asked him, who's your teacher? What does he teach? And then the Buddhist monk says this, and then that was enough to convert this follower. And then he went and got his friend, and both of them came over, and then the other teacher vomited hot blood and died, according to tradition, because he lost two of his best disciples to the Buddha. But getting back to this, referring to a shramana as a shaman, it's sort of backwards. The word shaman, I'm pretty sure I have been told that it is derived from Sanskrit shramana, which in Pali is samana, and I usually translate it as philosopher. It's usually translated as ascetic or renunciant. I think Ajahn Thanisara, who, as I say, has his own set of renderings for words, I think he refers to them as contemplatives. Contemplative might be a more literal translation of samana. But as Buddhism spread up into like Central Asia and like Mongolia, then you got like Siberian tribes and so forth, seeing these holy men that were referred to as shramana or something similar to shramana, and their own holy men, their witch doctors, their healers and so forth, adopted that term, and it became shaman. So it's not really saying that the Buddha was a shaman. It wasn't really an Indian concept at that time. At least you don't find it in the texts. So, it meant something different, and then it got appropriated by later spiritual traditions. So, let's see. Would I consider a translation like this valid? Yeah, all the translation is good, although thus proclaims the great shaman is probably not the best translation, because, he was... really, it's referring to him as a great philosopher, a great renunciant, ascetic philosopher. And, if you want to say shamans are renunciant, ascetic philosophers, then yeah, that might be a fair translation. But usually shaman is associated with like tribal, sort of animistic spirituality kind of stuff. So... let's see, going over this. Speaks of nature as the ultimate teacher of Dharma. To some degree, I suppose I could agree with that. Causality of a spiritual variety. Yeah. Yeah, but what it all boils down to apparently is, could you call a shramana, an ancient Indian shramana, a shaman. And although they have the same etymology because shaman is derived from shramana, or so I've been told, nevertheless, I think the meaning of shaman has diverged considerably from the original meaning of shramana, or the meaning that prevailed in the Buddhist time. So I'll just move on to the next question here, also from Lieberlam. What event brought you the most joy as a monk? What personal interaction brought you the most joy? What interaction that you were an outside viewer of brought you the most joy? Well, that's 3 questions, isn't it? I suppose I should separate these. So I'm going to separate them. Okay, that one's separated. And now this one's going to be separated. Okay. Now I got to do that. All right. So what event brought you the most joy as a monk? Oh, well, it's a long story, and I've got so many. I should just. I wrote an essay about this a long time ago called something like "The Great Experiment in Mediocrity," and I'll just give a very condensed version of it. In that, I'd been a monk for more than 10 years, and then I got sick. I got some kind of flu or something, and I just hit rock bottom. It's like any kind of enjoyment in life was gone. I couldn't take a bath anymore because I had a fever. The doctors were saying I should just sponge myself off instead of taking a real bath. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't meditate. I mean, I just hit this kind of depression of like thinking, I've been a monk all this time and I can still hit rock bottom like this and have no consolation. I mean, what's the point? And I even, after months of this feeling of just frustration and what's the point if I can still be depressed like this? I wrote a letter to my teacher in Burma. I wrote a letter to my father back in America saying, I just don't want to try as hard as I can anymore, because I was really just going full blast as a monk, as full blast as I could manage. And I was just, I just got as far as I could with it at the time. And so I'm just let go. It's like, I just kind of gave up. And then it was like right after that, it was like what I needed to do, because I was like grasping too tightly onto some aspect of my practice or some such, just fighting, using Khmer Rouge tactics against my own defilements, just struggling against my own nature, that what I had to do was just sort of relax, which is what happened when I sort of gave up. And all of a sudden I was experiencing the best meditation of my life, and just going into these spontaneous, it's like spontaneous mindfulness. Like I'd be at the well fetching a bucket of water, and you'd just be feeling the rope against the palms of your hands, and you'd be feeling the muscles and the joints moving, the tightening of the muscles as you're pulling, and you'd be feeling the breeze on your skin. Just everything is just crystal clear. And it was during this time that I was walking down to take a bath and get a bucket of water. I lived up on this hill. There was these stone steps that went down to the lower monastery. And I'm walking down these stone steps, and I just all of a sudden start getting really intense abdominal cramps, because apparently I ate some shrimp curry that had gone bad or something earlier that day. And just really intense, like stomach pains, abdominal cramps. I'm just doubled over. Anyone who saw my face would think that I was dying, just grimacing in pain. And I'm reflecting on the fact that in all probability, I'm going to be making at least 3 emergency trips to the outhouse that night. And then it started raining, and I had my upper robe on, and I only had 3 robes at the time: my upper robe, my lower robe, and an outer robe. And now I'm thinking, I didn't have an umbrella, so I'm thinking, well, I'm going to be wearing wet robes tomorrow because I'm getting rained on. I'm doubled over in pain, getting rained on. And then all of a sudden, it was like something kind of clicked. There was just this subtle shift. And all of a sudden, it was like the center of my awareness was like deep, deep down. And it was like I was in deep, still, cool water. And I could look up and see all this commotion going on at the surface, but it wasn't really affecting me anymore. I was down in this stillness, just peace. It was just sublime, this feeling that I was experiencing. And And I was so overwhelmed with joy, even though I still doubled over in pain, like at the surface level, the outward level, I'm still doubled over in pain, getting rained on, thinking about how I'm going to get the shits all night. Still, at this deeper level which was like the center of my awareness at the time, it was just like a miracle that I could be in that kind of pain and discomfort and so forth, and just be in a state of just utter bliss. And I was so happy that I was practically crying with joy, while at the same time, anyone who saw my face would think that I was dying. I had one new age guy tell me that's an enlightenment experience. So yeah, that brought me the most joy as a monk, I suppose. Meeting my sweetheart when I was a monk, we were just getting to know each other. I was still a monk at the time. We hadn't touched or anything, but it was very joyful also. So I'll move on to Lieberlam's next question here. What personal interaction brought you the most joy? I guess, yeah, I guess meeting my sweetheart. I was still a monk at the time, but yeah, I would say that. And then what interaction that you were an outside viewer of brought you the most joy? And the first thing that came to mind when I read this question, what interaction that you were an outside viewer of brought you the most joy? I'd been a monk for just a few years, and I was in Burma, and I was walking to the village for alms. So you have to walk through these kind of rice fields and stuff. There's this little trail, you'd be going through fields and so forth. And I got to the outskirts of the village of, let's see, what was the name of that village? Laypeople, which was in central Burma. And there was a dirt road leading out of the village, and you leave the trail through the fields, and you get onto the dirt road, and you walk the last 100 yards or so down this dirt road to get into the village. And I'm just getting to that dirt road, and there's a middle-aged man and apparently his wife are just walking along. They don't see me. They're just oblivious to anything but themselves, each other, really. They're just walking very slowly, just these smiles on their face that indicate that they very much enjoy each other's company, and they're just kind of murmuring to each other. And I mean, I just felt really happy. I mean, I really am happy when I see like old people that still love each other. They're still, it's not just a matter of habit or emotional attachment, but, they just still think that each other is like wonderful. It's just, and I guess I'm just sentimental. Like I was literally crying last night when I got to the end of the first Rocky movie. I watched the first Rocky movie last night. The ending of it always makes me cry. I get choked up. And I'm not like boo-hooing all over the place, but I was definitely choked up. So yeah, I guess seeing that middle-aged couple just obviously very much loving each other, just walking along slowly, just murmuring with smiles, peaceful smiles on their faces. I don't know, for some reason that really struck me at the time. So I'll just move on to the next question here. What was your favorite wild animal that you ever met? I guess it'd have to be Chicken Lord. And those of you who are unfamiliar with Chicken Lord, he was a red jungle fowl, like a wild chicken, who lived in the forest where I was living. And he was really a majestic beast. He really was. I'm pretty sure beasts don't have to be quadrupeds, because as like with most chickens, most roosters, he had 2 legs. But he was just really this noble, majestic animal, and we were friends, and we had respect for each other. At least I had respect for him. So I guess it'd be Chicken Lord. If you want the full details on Chicken Lord, a few months ago, I did a video in which I was describing Chicken Lord. He's one of the 2 coolest birds I ever met. So I'll just move on to the next question. That was fairly easy, which is, what was your favorite domesticated animal that you ever met? And that is really a tough question. My favorite domesticated animal that I ever met, certainly it would have to be a dog, because some of my best friends throughout life have been dogs. Some of my best friends have been scroungy Burmese village dogs, like Dunderhead. There was this dog that I called Dunderhead. He wasn't very bright. Burmese village dogs generally are not very intelligent. And I used to wonder about that until I finally read somewhere that brain tissue uses as much energy as strenuously exercising muscle tissue. And in a in a world where malnutrition and starvation are some of the leading causes of death, then having a small brain actually has survival value. And Dunderhead was kind of dumb, but see, he was technically he was the dog of a monastery attendant. He was like the nephew of one of the old monk who lived at the monastery, and he would come every once in a while and just do stuff that monks aren't supposed to do, like clearing grass and that sort of thing. And he had this dog that I called Dunderhead, and that dog, I mean, the Burmese people in general, really, as a general rule, there are some dog lovers, there are some animal lovers, but in Asia, dogs do not have the same kind of status as they have in the West. And his owner really didn't treat him very well, apparently, because all I'd have to do is just talk nice to him and maybe pet him a little bit, and he would just be like jumping around in just ecstasy. This dog, I mean, he just adored me. He just practically worshiped me. And it wasn't so much that he worshiped me. I mean, it wasn't like a narcissistic thing. It's like, oh, this dog worships me, therefore I like it. It's just, like the feeling was mutual. I mean, there's something about dogs, we've got this convergent evolution where we form a symbiosis. We just fit together really nice. And yeah, it's like my dog now, Genghis, he's out in the backyard right now. He's kind of the same way. He just looks up at me adoringly. It's like when I go out into the backyard, it's like, it's the high point of his day. And we just sincerely love each other. And I've been that way with lots of dogs in my life, and it'd be hard to pick out one in particular, my favorite domesticated animal, but it'd definitely have to be a dog. Some of my best friends in life have been dogs. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Alan, and I'm not sure if Alan is even expecting an answer. And this wasn't under a Q&A. This was under a different video. But it's a question, and he posted it. So I think sometimes he just asks rhetorical questions anyway. But I'll just read the question. I mean, we've got so many questions, might as well add another one here. So Alan says, it may be difficult. Where does it say in Theravada tradition that most monks won't experience jhana? Apparently a lot of Tibetan monks haven't either, and so that's the point and purpose of generating the winds. There's one Thai monk leader who had 3,000 of his monks learn transcendental meditation. Why? Because it takes you to transcendental consciousness, the sphere of nothingness, on the first day that you begin. Well, I guess the main question here is, where does it say in Theravada tradition that most monks won't experience jhana? It says it in there somewhere. The meaning of jhana changed. Originally, it just meant meditation. So first jhana, anyone who's just sitting there meditating properly, even if it's breathing in, breathing out, in my opinion, that would be first jhana. And so it's not all that hard to attain, but jhana has acquired the status of a superhuman mental state. It's defined as right concentration in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, but even so, apparently, according to Orthodox tradition, right concentration involves superhuman mental states, because the four jhanas are considered to be superhuman mental states, and even most monks do not attain them. In fact, you can find statements like 1 in a million, but that would be really sad if only 1 in a million could even get to first jhana. So, yeah, apparently a lot of Tibetan monks haven't either. See, jhana has acquired the state of like a very refined, advanced, contemplative state, like a mystical state. I wouldn't consider first jhana to be particularly mystical, but once you get up into second jhana, where you're no longer thinking, then I think that would qualify as a mystical state. That would be like what a contemplative Roman Catholic would call contemplation, or high contemplation. It's where you're no longer thinking. That's like in the contemplative orders of Roman Catholicism, probably Greek Orthodox. It's similar. If you're still thinking, it's called meditation. You're visualizing, certain aspects of Jesus's life, or you're using like a mantra, dear God, please have mercy upon me, a sinner, that sort of a thing, or the Ave Maria, or Hail Marys, or Lord's Prayer or something, then that would be meditation. But once you stop thinking and you're just clearing your mind of all mental states as well as you can, then you're getting up into contemplation. And that's essentially what second jhana and above would be from a Buddhist perspective, from a Theravada Buddhist perspective. And most people just do not attain these mystical states. And Alan here, he was really resisting the idea that it's difficult to attain jhana. I mean, originally jhana just meant meditation, so that wasn't so difficult to attain. But somewhere relatively early on in the development of Buddhist philosophy, it got turned into superhuman mental states. And then later, he's one Thai monk leader who had 3,000 of his monks learn transcendental meditation. Why? Because it takes you to transcendental consciousness, whatever that means. And the sphere of nothingness on the first day that you begin, yeah, I would call BS on that. That transcendental meditation leads to the sphere of nothingness, which in itself, I mean, the sphere of nothingness is probably an anachronism that, I mean, it wasn't taught by the Buddha himself, in my opinion, that it was originally like a metaphor for enlightenment or something that got turned into, after nothingness kind of fell by the wayside as an interpretation of enlightenment, maybe because it was just like a feeble attempt or something, that it got rejected, but it already got traction in the tradition. So then they just relegate it to this sub-enlightened, but nevertheless very exalted contemplative state. And the sphere of nothingness, it would be a formless jhana that would be either a variation of or higher than fourth jhana, which originally was probably the highest level of meditation you could possibly get to. And to say that practicing transcendental meditation, like TM, like the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was teaching, that the first day that you're already like at the higher levels of fourth jhana, yeah, I would just call BS on that. Maybe a few people, but certainly not anywhere near to 1% would be experiencing a formless jhana, their very first attempt at meditating. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. Do you have a notion of the term yogi in the Theravada tradition? I have a dim recollection of finding it in some sort of commentarial text. I don't think it was ever used by the Buddha, but it looms large in Mahayana and Vajrayana tradition. Could it be a subcontinental contamination of Sinhala Theravada? Well, I actually looked up the term yogi in my Pali Tipitaka, which is digital on this computer, as I had previously implied. And yogi only appears in later texts. They are canonical, some of them, like the Nidesa, the Parisambhida Magga, the questions of King Milinda. They're old. They're old enough, some of them at least, to be canonical. Like in the Burmese Tipitaka, the Milinda Panya is canonical, even though it's not considered to be canonical in other traditions, other Theravada traditions. But so apparently, yeah, it's a later addition to Theravada Buddhist, like philosophical jargon or ethical jargon. I mean, yoga kema, I think, is a term that's found in very ancient texts. So yoga, the word yoga is contained in very ancient texts, but there it means like the yoke. Yoga kema is like rest from the yoke. It's sort of like a metaphor for enlightenment, freedom from bondage kind of a thing. But with regard to yogi in Theravada, it's a common term in Burma. It's actually incorporated into the Burmese language, where a yogi means a lay meditator, usually a female lay meditator. In fact, a Burmese lady who's called a yogi, she usually she has her hair in a bun unless she shaves it, and she wears brown. and usually has like a mala or like a Buddhist meditation rosary around her neck and like a Tibet or a kind of scarf thing over one shoulder. It's like a uniform. So, but it can just mean meditator in general in Theravada Buddhism. So let's see here. I'll just move on to the next question. This is from K Zen. And K Zen says, if you could take a pill that would instantly and permanently dissolve all sexual desires while enhancing and speeding up your spiritual path without any side effects, would you do it? And that reminds me of, I used to think, I mean, if they invented an enlightenment pill, you just take this pill and you will become enlightened. I used to think that most people, including most monks, would run from that pill as though they were running from a rabid demon-possessed snake. Just because it's so scary, you know, it's almost, enlightenment is almost like death. Who you think you are stops being who you think you are. But with regard to, I mean, if I could take a pill that would instantly and permanently dissolve all sexual desires while enhancing and speeding up my spiritual path as a monk, even though I might have dread in my heart because lust can be enjoyable, then I'd have to do it. But now I'm a layman and I've got a woman. And yeah, I mean, I would not want to dissolve all sexual desires while having this sweet, snuggly, affectionate female that it is my manly duty to satisfy, if at all possible. And it's very pleasant, I have to admit. So yeah, as a layperson now, I've got certain, I wouldn't want to call it duties. I mean, they're like duties that I enthusiastically carry out or attempt to carry out. So yeah, I wouldn't take the pill now, just because I'm in a relationship and, you know, but as a monk, I would have had to do it, even if I just had dread in my heart. I remember I took some kind of medication or medication. I took a kind of medicine once in Burma, and not only did it cause my entire body to break out in a rash, but it completely or almost completely erased my libido for days. And I missed it. I mean, it was like, it just, life just seemed just flat and really kind of pointless. You don't have a libido. It's like life really does just seem like flat and insipid, which I guess is the point. If you're a monk, you know, you want to get as flat and insipid as possible in manner of speaking. But yeah, I'm not a I'm not a monk anymore, and I'm no longer celibate. So I just I'd politely decline the pill. I might take the pill and offer it to somebody else or something. So the next question is from Aliens Did It. And Aliens Did It says, the Pali translator Ken Wheeler claims that original Buddhism never taught the doctrine of no self, and the term anatta is used relationally in the Nikayas. That is, it is used to indicate what the self is not as an apophatic methodology. Do you think this is correct? Well, that's in one word, no. In fact, I would hardly consider Ken Wheeler to be an actual translator. I've read some of his translations and he just butchers the Pali language, while at the same time just bragging on his YouTube videos about how he is the world's authority on early Buddhism and on the Pali language. And he's just bullshitting people because he can't get like simple Pali correct. Like if you read his article on, he's got this theory that Mahakassapa, who was the Buddha's senior disciple after the Buddha died, that Mahakassapa actually was involved in murdering the Buddha, which is, I mean, slandering a saint. I mean, that's a guarantee of hell according to Buddhist tradition. So he better be right. He better get his, not his facts straight, because he's not really dealing with facts, because he's translating terms like there's the word kamara, which means metalsmith. It's based on Vedic Sanskrit. It goes all the way back to long before the Buddha, you know, more than 1,000 years before the Buddha's time. Kamara meant a metalsmith or a blacksmith, well, maybe a bronzesmith earlier on. But Ken Wheeler has like somehow added a macron to the Mara So that he translates it as son of the evil one, because it was a metalsmith who fed the Buddha his last meal. The Buddhas fed him a kind of, it was like tainted pork or something, and it caused the Buddha to have like an attack of like violent stomach pains and bloody diarrhea and so forth, and he died after that. So Ken Wheeler is trying to make him out as son of the evil, son of Mara, when, I mean, obviously Kamara just means metalsmith, and it's not even spelled the same as Mara. Mara has like a little macron, a little line over the A, which is a different vowel from the A without the macron. In English, they're both A, but in Pali or whatever, I mean, it's totally different letters. Like a long A and a short A aren't even the same letter. So, I mean, he'll translate chitta, which means mind. Sometimes it means heart. He'll translate it as soul, as a way of proving that Buddhism teaches a soul. But the thing with Ken Wheeler is, I mean, aside from just bragging about he's the world's leading authority on this, that, and the other, not just on early Buddhism, but also on like, it's some aspects of physics also, apparently. He's like the world's leading authority. But he's like some kind of Neoplatonist, or, man, I don't want to offend Neoplatonists, but I mean, he believes in like the perennial philosophy, that there is like an immortal soul, but it's not like a worldly thing. And he very much insists that Buddhism taught this, and Buddhism just didn't. And so he's got to like twist and warp and stretch the Pali language in order to find his proofs that the Buddha did not teach no self. And I mean, I can sort of agree that the Buddha did not insist upon no self, because in very early texts, like in the Atthakavagga, it's referring to no self and no not self. You just don't have a belief about it one way or the other. And I mean, he declares himself apophatic. He follows apophasis. I think that's part of his name on his YouTube thing. But apophasis, I mean, you don't talk about it. You can't put it into words. And here he is just insisting and insisting and insisting, which is not apophatic at all. So, yeah, I mean, it's a stretch even to call Ken Wheeler a Pali translator. And I'm not jumping at this to bash Ken Wheeler, but somebody did ask this question. And so I'm just giving my honest opinion. But yeah, it's really hard to stretch the Pali text enough that you can say that anatta is not a fundamental teaching, that no self is not a fundamental teaching. There are a lot of people who try and do it, especially Westerners. So they just do not like not having a soul. Or at least they do not like not having an ultimately real soul. I mean, you can really meet with people in the West who consider themselves to be Buddhists, but who will just rage and just say, you are a son of Mara yourself, you are evil, you're going to hell because you say that the Buddha taught that there's no soul or no self, when it's just right there in black and white. And you really have to stretch and twist and engage in all this sophistry in order to make the text not say that there is no self. But there are people that are like that, especially Western Buddhists. So I better just move on to the next question here. This is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, question of the day, is being awake different than nirvana? Well, it depends on, man, we're dealing with what cannot be described in words again. But like Buddha literally means awakened. So it's kind of a metaphor for enlightenment. And nirvana is also a way of describing enlightenment in the ethical sense. So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, awake can mean nirvana. But it's more like the attainment of nirvana rather than the metaphysical state of nirvana, because the metaphysical state of nirvana, there'd be no no body or no being or anything to be called awake. But it's all paradoxical. I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Titus de Acenthis. And Titus de Acenthis says, there's a few excellent Buddhist jokes. Do you have any favorites? And if so, would you tell one? I've never really liked Buddhist jokes very much. It just, especially jokes about the Buddha. Like as a monk, it's actually forbidden to make jokes about Buddha, Dhamma, or Sangha. That it's an offense requiring confession if you make a joke about Buddha, Dhamma, or Sangha, because you're like in a way like being sarcastic or belittling something that is sacred. Sort of like telling Jesus jokes if you're a Christian. So I have heard a few Buddhist jokes, but I never really appreciated them. I've seen some Buddhist memes that are good. So yeah, Buddhist memes, I'd be more inclined to have favorites, but I'm not set up here to show you any of my favorite Buddhist memes. So do I have any favorite Buddhist jokes? The only Buddhist joke that I can think of that I'd even be willing to repeat is like, how many Zen monks does it take to change a light bulb? That's two, one to change the light bulb and one not to change the light bulb. But that's not very funny. If you read the text, you can find funny stuff. Like, I guess you could call the verse of the Dhammapada that has that's made up of puns, almost the entire verse of the Dhammapada, and I forgot to look up exactly what number it is. But it's made up almost entirely of puns. And it's, the man who is faithless and ungrateful, a burglar who destroys opportunities and eats vomit. He truly is the highest of men. That you can read this verse this way. That they had to do it on purpose. The man who is faithless and ungrateful, a burglar who destroys opportunities and eats vomit. He truly is the highest of men. You could call that kind of a joke. It's a series of puns that, obviously it's supposed to be humorous or something. So, I could say maybe that's my favorite Buddhist joke. Maybe there's a lot of like Zen stories and Zen koans that are funny and kind of joke-like, but I think I better just move on to the next question here. So the next question from Titus de Acenthis is, how can a Buddhist prove that the universe was not created last Thursday? Or more seriously put, how do Theravada Buddhists justify belief in rebirth? It is a known and well-proven fact that over time, to various extent, memories degrade, distort, mutate, morph, fade away, etc. Hence the terrible uncertainty of definite knowledge. How can then one prove that the universe was not created last Thursday, let alone claim that rebirth or reincarnation is a fact? Must be by something other than memories. Yeah, I remember in a book by Bertrand Russell, I think it was Human Knowledge, Its Scope and Limits, or it could have been a different one. He said that, really, you cannot prove that some deity with a strange sense of humor just created this universe yesterday and just implanted in everybody memories of things that never happened. There's no way you can prove that didn't happen. You cannot prove that God created everything yesterday and we just have fake memories of things that happened before then. You can't prove that. And a Buddhist can't prove it either. Maybe an enlightened Buddhist or an enlightened being, they just get beyond that and they just know ultimate reality. They just, it becomes irrelevant. But let's see. Yeah, so how can you prove rebirth? The average Buddhist can't prove anything. Nobody can prove anything other than maybe something that's entirely internal to your own mind. You might be able to prove a theorem of Euclid or something, or like chess moves or something in your mind, something that's entirely contained within your own mind. But when you're dealing with something that lies outside of your mind, there's always going to be uncertainty. So Spinoza talked about it, David Hume talked about it, and that's one reason why they're two of the most famous Western philosophers, because they just pulled the rug out from underneath everybody. They were just merciless, really, with regard to absolute knowledge. The only absolute knowledge that you can have is enlightenment. So, I mean, everything else is just conventional truth. And I think he's probably going to call me out on something here later on. I vaguely remember it, but let's see. I'll just stick with this question here. Okay, so nobody can prove that the universe was not created last Thursday. Neither a Buddhist nor anybody else, not an atheist, not a Christian, nobody. Or more seriously put, how do Theravada Buddhists justify belief in rebirth? It's a convenient working hypothesis. Period. It really is. And there's no way you can absolutely prove it one way or the other. So I'll just move on to the next question here. 3. And speaking of Thursdays, have you read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Has it not a subtle Zen Buddhist feeling to it? No, I never read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I think I saw like a movie version of it a long time ago, but it's very vague and hazy. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. That was an easy one. Those are the easiest questions where I just say, I don't know. I don't know. I never read it. I don't know the person. I don't know. So, and then Titus Synthesis, last question here. And speaking of Zen, notice a pattern here. Once asked, what is Nirvana? Soto Zen monk Suzuki Roshi replied, there are actually 2 Suzuki Roshis, I'm not sure which one he's talking about, seeing one thing through to the end. So what is Nirvana? And a Zen Roshi replied, seeing one thing through to the end. For me, a perfectly satisfying answer. I remember you answering some questions about Nirvana, Nibbana differences, but oh, these degrading memories. Tried to read a lengthy article, but that gave me a headache. Do you have a concise answer? What is Nirvana? My interpretation of Nirvana is, I mean, from the metaphysical point of view, it is ultimate reality. And from an ethical point of view, it is like attainment of ultimate reality, or just awareness of ultimate reality, especially if it's persistent. You know, once you just fully got it and it doesn't go away. You don't backslide from it. But there's other ways of describing Nirvana. The end of greed, hate, and delusion, the end of Lobha, Dosa, Moha, the end of dukkha, or like I said earlier, in Abhidhamma, it's the principle of cessation. So, but I mean, from my personal point of view, it's reality. Nirvana is reality. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Ketchup. What is the best parita for possession? Ratana Sutta? Atanatiya Sutta? Thank you. In Burma, at least, the go-to, the panacea for like demonic entities or ghosts or anything that's trying to possess you, anything like that, is the Metta Sutta. That's, according to tradition, the Metta Sutta was developed, or the Buddha came up with the Metta Sutta as a way of protecting monks from malevolent non-human beings. So yeah, I'd go with the Metta Sutta. Also, it's got a lot of wisdom in it. The Ratana Sutta is mostly just worshipy devotionalist stuff. The Atanatiya Sutta also is largely worshipy, like devotionalistic stuff. Whereas the Metta Sutta actually has some meaty Dhamma to it that isn't just devotionalism, but it's got real Dhamma in it. So that would make it stronger too, in my opinion. So I would recommend the Metta Sutta. So the next question is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, can you make a video on the Dhammacakka Sutta where you explain it in detail? It's theoretically possible. I doubt that I'll be doing it anytime soon. But the Dhammacakka Pavattana Sutta is, according to tradition, the Buddha's first sermon after his enlightenment, where he lays forth, the Four Noble Truths and the middle path and so forth. It's considered to be somewhat anachronistic. Like Western Buddhist scholars will say, well, it's like K.R. Norman wrote a famous controversial article saying that it is anachronistic, that it's taking for granted later developments in Buddhist philosophy and so forth. But yeah, I can get to it. I mean, it would, yeah, maybe. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doas says, what is the longest time you sat in meditation for? And I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, I know the longest time I've sat in meditation without moving in the full lotus. It was a little over 2 hours because my legs are not very flexible. My father couldn't even squat down on his heels because his legs were so inflexible. And I've acquired a little bit of that, I think. So the longest I ever sat without changing position would be a little over 2 hours, because as a monk, I almost always sat in the full lotus. And doing it for more than an hour started getting painful. But there have been times when I would just change position every now and then and just keep sitting. So yeah, that might be more than 3 hours or 4 hours or something. But yeah, long meditation really didn't work for me so much because it was so intense. You had to maintain this intense awareness the whole time if you're meditating correctly. So I tended to prefer no more than an hour, sort of like the way Zen Buddhists do shikantaza, where, generally they don't do it for long periods of time. And also, I learned the value of just alternating walking and sitting meditations. So you sit for an hour, you get up and walk until your legs are stretched, and you can sit down without pain again, and then you sit down and meditate some more, and you just alternate sitting and walking. Like that's the standard Mahasi method, is you sit or first you walk for an hour, then you sit for an hour, then you walk for an hour, then you sit for an hour. You just do that throughout the day. So that's pretty much what I was doing, although I wasn't really an advocate of the Mahasi method. So I'll just move on to the next question here, and this is from Rourke. And Rourke says, thoughts on Churchill, your experience of Burmese opinion of him, the English in general, and Akhand Bharat, or Indian hypernationalism. Well, I never heard a Burmese person mention Churchill, as far as I know. Oh, the computer is telling me that I haven't plugged it in yet. Just a second. This keeps happening. Continually forget to plug in the computer when I'm sitting in this room. There we go. The computer just went, ah. Okay, so yeah, I don't remember any Burmese person discussing Winston Churchill to me. My opinion on Churchill, I've had some interactions with like right-winger types or other types, I suppose, who just think Churchill was evil. And partly it's because these same right-winger types, or whatever they happen to be, generally prefer Hitler. And, or like, there's the historian David Irving, who just despised Churchill. And Churchill is, he's accused of being a sellout to the Jews and so forth, and so on and so forth. But I mean, I admire Churchill. He was a good writer, and I think he was. I mean, he seemed to have been a good prime minister also. So, yeah, I really have not been persuaded by the Churchill is evil faction of history. Let's see. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I don't know about him, and it may be that he did have wealthy Jews supporting him, but then again, a lot of politicians do. I mean, it's hard to amount to anything in politics without wealthy Jews supporting you, I suppose. Consider Donald Trump, for example. So let's see here. Yeah, okay. The Burmese opinion of the English in general. The government, they used to use the English as a scapegoat. I mean, like the military dictatorship. If things sucked, it's because of the British colonialists fucking things up before they left the country, which wasn't true. I mean, Burma was the richest country in Southeast Asia under the British Raj. And then very shortly thereafter, it became the poorest country in Southeast Asia, just due to general incompetence. Because Burma should not be a poor country. It's wealthy in natural resources. It's not grotesquely overpopulated. You know, it should be a successful, prosperous country, but it's just that the government is incompetent. And that's not just the military dictatorship, even before the military dictatorship. I mean, it was like General Aung San was going to be the first president or prime minister, you know, the first leader of free Burma after liberation from British colonialism. And he and almost his entire cabinet were assassinated by some lone wolf gunman, supposedly. I'm holding the toothpick, so I can't do the quotes right. Here we go. And then he was replaced by U Nu. And U Nu was an intelligent person. He was a devout Buddhist, but he had some weird ideas. Like he started planting coconut plantations all over the country because there's a certain deva called Min Mahagiri who likes coconuts. And he was trying to get on the good side of the gods by having lots and lots of coconuts in the country. I mean, weird things like that, weird superstitious things that really do not help the country all that much, unless Min Mahagiri really did favor the country. But apparently Min Mahagiri didn't, because the country just kept like sliding into anarchy and civil war until the first time the military dictatorship took over. U Nu actually invited them to take over, and then once they got things under control, more or less, they handed it back to U Nu, and then it just started sliding into anarchy and chaos and civil war again. And so the second time, the military just took over and just didn't give control back. And then relatively recently, you had the pro-democracy movement, you know, heavily endorsed by the Western liberal types. And I guess that sort of fell through a few years later with the new military junta. But so the Burmese government will badmouth like the British colonialists as just kind of a scapegoat for anything bad in the country. It's because the colonialists did it or whatever, which is just propaganda, really. But I think most Burmese people, aside from just the national pride of kind of resenting having been colonized and treated like coolies, they have a fairly high opinion of the West, or of like America and the British. You know, they think that America and the British are clever and they have a good system, and they wish that their system more closely resembled the American system, although in some ways Burma is lucky that they're under a military dictatorship, because it keeps all the Walmarts and McDonald's and stuff out of the country. And you cannot serve both God and mammon. And when you've got no mammon to serve, it's easier to serve God. Or in other words, you're going to have more Dhamma in the country. Because once people start getting rich and fat and spoiled, then they start forgetting Dhamma. So I'll just move on to Rourke's next question. Oh, wait, I didn't answer the part about the Akhand Bharat, or Indian hypernationalism. I really don't know that much about it. There's a conservative political commentator that I watch on YouTube sometimes, Dr. Turley. What's his name? Dr. Steve Turley. And yeah, he kind of praises Indian nationalism because he's referring to civilization states. You know, he's talking about postmodernism is giving rise to civilization states where globalism is fragmenting. People aren't believing in globalism anymore. That even, postmodernism itself has pretty much killed globalism, because globalism assumed that there's one truth fits all. That, you know, a kind of liberal democracy is just the best kind of government. And you know, there are certain assumptions, you know, like civil rights, human rights, you know, freedom of religion and all this, that it just applies to everything. And obviously history has shown that some countries just resist that, like in the Middle East. Trying to force liberal democracy onto a country results in just really strong pushback. And then you wind up with a king or something, or a military dictatorship. And so, I mean, he's referring to India as one of these civilization states that postmodernism has allowed this globalist vision to kind of fragment. And so certain countries, including Russia, are like taking pride in their ancient traditions and in their nationality again. And he sees that as a good thing. And I mean, whatever is bad for what is passing for globalism nowadays isn't all bad. So, yeah, that's about all I know about Indian hypernationalism, is just the idea of Indians, identifying en masse as Hindus and Indians, and taking pride in that, and going back to their roots and to their traditions and so forth. And that's not entirely a bad thing, and it's to some degree inevitable. So I'll just move on to Rourke's next questions. This is a really easy one. Thoughts on the order of 9 angles. And maybe is that supposed to be 9 angels? It's got spelled angles here. Thoughts on the order of 9 angles. And I have no idea what that is. 9 angels, I don't know what that is either. I mean, 9 sisters, I've heard of that before. The 9 sisters, but I don't think that's it. So thoughts on the order of 9 angles? I don't have any thoughts on that because I don't know what it is. So next question from Rourke. Thoughts on the misanthropic Luciferian order. I find their conception of chaos interesting and somewhat analogous to Kali and Nibbana. Of course, by they, I'm going to put the toothpick down again, they, I mean the 3 people who are ever a member of the cult, which is another interesting point. Yeah, and as far as I know, I've never heard of the misanthropic Luciferian order either. This is maybe some kind of neo-Satanism that doesn't necessarily worship devils, but is just sort of like atheistic, and I don't know. Yeah, I've never had any interest at all in anything that goes by Satanism, not even very much interest over the course of my life in paganism, other than maybe like classical Greco-Roman paganism. That would be the most interesting kind of paganism to me, like Neoplatonism. That would be interesting to me, but I'm almost totally ignorant of like Luciferian orders, misanthropic or otherwise. So I'll just move on to Rourke's next question here. Do you really believe in Buddhism, or at least in what you consider are the historical teachings of the Buddha? I hope it's not an insulting question, but you are constantly espousing heterodox beliefs and openness to being wrong, and it seems like a short step away to simple atheism and agnosticism. No, I'm more of a Buddhist than anything else, and I am happy to say that in my studies of trying to find out what the original teachings of Gautama Buddha were, that those are the teachings that I accept the most, like the Atthakavagga, the Sutta Nipata. I mean, that body of text right there was enough to keep me in robes as long as I was in robes. Because there's a lot of stuff that I do not consider to be authentic Buddha Vachana, or the teachings of the Buddha, that is later developments. Same with Christianity, same with just about any religion, any religious tradition. You start off with like an archaic core of teachings, and then as it becomes a popular religion, it just starts mutating like a virus. Especially the first few centuries, it just explodes in this. It's almost like the Cambrian explosion in biology, where all these life forms just all these weird forms and everything. And that's happens in religions too. When it takes off, it becomes a popular movement. Then you got all sorts, throwing in their 2 cents and changing the thing a lot. But I am happy to say that my studies, trying to get as close to what the Buddha originally taught as possible, not just according to my own judgment, but the judgment of scholars that I respect, that, serious scholars, that, that is the stuff I believe the most. It just rings true. There's like this intuitive yes to it. So, yeah, I do really believe in Buddhism, or at least in what I consider are the historical teachings of Gautama Buddha. Yeah, and I am going with the working hypothesis that Gautama Buddha was an enlightened being, if that even means anything. He was extremely highly advanced sage. So, yeah, I think I'll just move on to Rourke's next question. And that is thoughts on RFK Jr. And really, I really don't know much about RFK Jr. I haven't sat through any of his talks, any of his interviews. I've just little bits and pieces. I know that he talks funny because of some health issue that he had. Very like gravelly, scratchy, almost non-vertin. What do you say? I'm not sure what the word is, but and that he's also kind of down on the pharmaceutical industry because he's saying that the coronavirus thing was just largely a hoax perpetrated by world governments or national governments in a globalist cabal or something. But yeah, I mean, he's better than Biden. Just about anybody would be better than Biden, I think. Because Biden is essentially a vegetable. So let's see. I guess I'll just see what's Rourke's next question here. Also, thoughts on metaphysical atomism. Does Buddhism say anything about the ultimate nature of samsaric reality in regards to atomism, other than the easy rejoinder that it doesn't really matter because it is an ultimate reality? Well, Abhidhamma is atomism par excellence. If I understand what he's talking about, that metaphysical atomism, sort of like Democritus or something, that everything is made up of atoms. Yeah, like Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, which I don't necessarily follow strictly, and Abhidhamma philosophy has everything divided up into atoms, except for a few ultimate realities are not divided up into particles. Nibbana itself is not divided up into particles. And if I remember correctly, there's like empty space, which according to Abhidhamma only exists in between particles. That you can't just say there's infinite empty space. This only the only reality of space is the space between two other things. So that would not be atomic either, other than indirectly, because it has to be between atomic things. But even mental states are atomic, according to Orthodox Theravada tradition. I don't believe it. I mean, it's not found in the suttas at all. This atomism that got developed later on, it's not found in the suttas, or maybe in like really late ones, maybe like sort of indirect mentions of it. So, does Buddhism say anything about the ultimate nature of samsaric reality in regard to atomism? Yeah, I mean, it's completely atomistic. I mean, other than that each atom is itself blinking on and off like a trillion times a second. So they're not an atom in the sense of Democritus, who is saying that they're like eternal or something, that they cannot be destroyed because they last only one moment and then are replaced by another one, and they keep flashing off and on. So it's atomism in time as well as in space. So it's even more atomistic than atoms that are just eternal, like 19th century physics assumed. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Keep the Vinaya. And Keep the Vinaya says, ooh, this is going to be a long one. I just noticed we've already been going about 2 hours, almost 2 hours. And I don't know how far down this thing I am. Keep the Vinaya says, would it have been better if you had lived as a monk in Thailand instead of Burma? The Thais place more emphasis on the Vinaya rules and less on the Abhidhamma, while it is the exact other way around with the Burmese. No, actually, I always considered myself lucky that I lived in Burma instead of Thailand, that I was ordained in a Burmese tradition instead of a Thai tradition. And partly it's because the Thais are way more conformity oriented. The Burmese, they just conform this spontaneously. They're very conformity oriented, but they don't make a rule of it. They don't enforce it because it just happens so naturally to them that they just conform. But then I didn't conform, and they just kind of let me not conform. So, I mean, in Thailand, you'd have to do things that you knew weren't correct just because everybody else did it, and that's what you have to do too because everybody else is doing it. Also, the Burmese are much more into meditation than the Thais. So the Burmese are more into scholarship, including Abhidhamma and meditation, whereas the Thais are more into Vinaya and Dhutanga. But I could practice Vinaya and Dhutanga as strictly as I pleased in Burma. I was just doing it on my own. But I was living alone as much as possible too. So I mean, the conformity stuff really wasn't much of an issue. So I'll just move on to keep the Vinayas next question here because there's a boatload of questions. Have you ever listened to speeches of Ashin Wirathu? Is your Burmese good enough to understand him? Is he really calling for violence against Muslims, or is it Western propaganda? No, I've never listened to a speech of Ashin Wirathu. My Burmese, I mean, I'd have to listen very intently. I'd have to really concentrate in order to understand like a recording of a Dhamma talk in Burmese. Is he really calling for violence against the Muslims, or is it Western propaganda? As a monk, he has to sort of dance around actually calling for violence, but it's implied. We have to get rid of these Muslims. I mean, it's sort of implied that, I mean, obviously the Muslims aren't necessarily going to be willing to leave. So you just have to get rid of the Muslims whether they want to leave or not, kind of stuff. So there is some implied violence, and I mean, he will say that he's not endorsing violence, but in order to get what he wants, I think a certain amount of violence is pretty much necessary. So yeah, I mean, when he's called like the face of Buddhist terror, like on that Time magazine, that's Western propaganda, because I mean, he's saying what a lot of other Burmese, like Sita Gusiano, who is more famous than Ashin Wirathu in Burma, he says kind of the same stuff. He's saying, it's not good to have Burma overrun by Muslims. We have to do something about it, and just kind of leaves it hanging. They can't really endorse violence. They're not calling for genocide or anything like that. But I mean, it is kind of implied if you work out the ramifications of getting rid of Muslims in Burma. I mean, there's probably going to be some a certain amount of aggression going on in both directions. So I think I'll just move on to the next question from Keep Nirvana. Have you ever used a loop of prayer beads for mantras back in Burma, and is it common for monks to use them there? It's very common for monks to use malas or prayer beads, and I got one or two as a monk because sometimes I'd feel sleepy, and I had this idea, it was like an experiment, that if I just have to keep my thumb moving to work the beads, it would help to keep me awake. And I experimented with it a little bit, but it's too kind of, it's not subtle enough of a meditation. It's too coarse of a meditation that I didn't like it very much. So I did it very little. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is, what is your view on antinatalism? Isn't it better for couples not to have children since they are one of the biggest attachments one can have? Also, according to the Gabavakandi Sutta, the Buddha said the following: Nanda, I do not extol the production of a new existence even a little bit, nor do I extol the production of a new existence for even a moment. Why? The production of a new existence is suffering. For example, even a little bit of vomit stinks. In the same way, Nanda, the production of a new existence, even a little bit, even for a moment, is suffering. Therefore, Nanda, whatever comprises birth, namely the arising of matter, its subsistence, its growth, and its emergence, the arising, subsistence, growth, and emergence of feeling, conceptualization, conditioning, forces, and consciousness, all that is suffering. Subsistence is illness, growth is old age and death. Therefore, Nanda, what contentment is there for one who is in the mother's womb wishing for existence? So, get back up to the top of this question. What is my view on antinatalism? Well, if you're going to renounce the world, I mean, if you really think that any existence is suffering, it should be abandoned, then you renounce the world, you don't get married, you don't have kids, you don't have a family, you might not even have many friends, you don't have money, you don't have a home, you just radical renunciation. But with regard to couples, I mean, once you've got a couple, I mean, a lot of couples are living in countries that do not have a welfare state, and so their social security is their kids supporting them after they get old. So, like in Burma, you don't have kids; you're just going to be like the drunk uncle or aunt, the old maid aunt living with like your sister's family or something. But there's got to be children somehow in order to keep society going. So, I mean, if you want to renounce society, then yeah, of course you shouldn't have children. But, I mean, if you're not renouncing society, I mean, it may be necessary or it may even be spiritually a good thing for you because maybe you're just not ripe for completely letting go of samsara and all in one go. So, for some people, not having children is best. I didn't have any children. So, but I was a monk for 30 years. If I wasn't a monk, I probably would have gotten married. And if my wife wanted to have children, I mean, I think having children is more important for some women than it is for most guys that, they just kind of identify with, their maternal instincts to some degree that, yeah, I mean, it'd be my duty as a man. If my wife couldn't really be happy without kids, then yeah, I might agree to 2 at most, maybe 3 absolute tops. But yeah, that's all academic now because it's unlikely that at my age I'm going to be having any kids. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, for monks, that's fine. And for some lay people, that's fine, but it's not going to work for everybody. And I mean, the human race is just going to die off if nobody has kids. And then the monks are going to starve too because there's going to be no lay people feeding them. So I think I'll just move on to Keep the Vinya's next and last question. Can a monk tell a layperson what he likes to eat if he gets asked? And yeah, if a layperson asks you what your favorite food is, then the monk can say, I like this or that. And, or if the layperson says, if there's anything that you want, just let me know. They give advance permission. Then you can ask for like fancy food, like meat or curd. There's a list of fancy foods, choice foods, including meat and fish, and that's also found in the Mahayana Patimokkha rules. So they may insist that Buddha did not allow the eating of meat, but their own Patimokkha rules, which are very archaic, going way back to the early days of Buddhism, they have these same rules saying, you can't ask for meat or fish unless you're sick or you've been given permission to ask for such things. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Conrad. And Conrad says, what is a skillful action and what is an unskillful action? Skillful and unskillful are not clear to someone judging the actions of an arahant. There's a sutta where the Buddha says that even if something is true but not beneficial, it is not worth saying it. Or something is true beneficial but consequently will bring suffering, it is good to say it. I wish I could remember the name of this sutta. There's a saying I like from Padmasambhava. My realization is higher than the sky, but my observance of karma is finer than grains of flour. Only an arahant can have a fine observance of the karmic effect of his actions! Exclamation point. There's something interesting about the Mahayanist perspective on bodhisattvas, that a bodhisattva can act in an evil way to each his own medicine. After Lord Buddha, I bow to Lord Dukkha. Okay, well, I guess the questions are way up at the top here. What is skillful action and what is unskillful action? Well, physically, unskillful action would be breaking the 5 precepts. It's like killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, which would include adultery, promiscuity, rape, that kind of a thing. Wrong speech, which is mainly telling of lies, but also like bad mouthing people and so forth. And then also taking wine, ale, or intoxicants which cause cloudedness of mind. So that would physically be unskillful actions. Also, you could include like right livelihood. So, um, so a wrong livelihood would include, selling weapons, selling poison, selling slaves, selling animals for slaughter, and so forth. So those, I mean, at the surface level, the external physical level, that would be unskillful action. With regard to unskillful mental actions, and it's standard in the text. It's like greed, hate, and delusion pretty much encompass all of them. Selfishness and stinginess and, let's see, just envy, ill will, all these kind of mental states that a sage would not have, presumably. That they would be unskillful, and anything that isn't that way is skillful. So you can just sit there not doing anything, and that would be skillful, because skillful is just anything that isn't unskillful. So being skillful can just be totally effortless. You can just sit there and not do anything, and that's skillful. So let's see. Skillful and unskillful are not clear for someone judging the actions of an arahant. Yeah, because you don't know what the mental states of an arahant are. Because really, I mean, if you get past the surface level, whether something is wholesome or unwholesome depends on the mental states. It depends on the motives, like the will that is motivating the action. And you may not know what the motive is. I mean, sometimes it's fairly obvious. If someone's like screaming and pounding on somebody, you know that they don't have good motives. But especially if they just walk up to somebody and start screaming and pounding on them for no apparent reason. But yeah, with regard to an arhat, I mean, it's like once they've crossed the flood, they throw the raft away. They don't need dharma practice anymore. They might do it spontaneously, just because, but still, I mean, it's like they've gone beyond ordinary ethics because they no longer have these gross motives for their actions. So their actions outwardly might appear really awful or questionable at best, but you don't know what their motives are. If they're an enlightened sage, they're not going to have bad motives. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Matthew. And Matthew said, just curious, how many hours a day did you usually meditate as a monk? Well, for my first at least 10 years, I was probably averaging at least 6 hours a day of meditation. I was really going for it. And then it gradually tapered off until towards the end, I was hardly meditating at all, just because I had stopped making progress and it was just too frustrating to continue with it. So, because I was just sort of treading water at best. And my best meditation in my life occurred between like the years 2000 and 2004. And just that was it. It was those were the glory days or something. And I never was able to regain that, except just sort of like the residual effects of having attained it to begin with. So yeah, at least my first 10 years, I was averaging like 6 hours a day because I was doing it a lot. I was meditating a lot. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Bodhisattva 969. And Bodhisattva 969 says, do you think that Buddhism in the West mainly attracts people who have health or mental problems? Because then you become aware of your own mortality. For my part, I've had problems with cardiac arrhythmia since I was about 19, sometimes better, sometimes worse. For my part, I then looked for something non-material and ended up with the Buddhist teachings, suffering, old age, sickness, death. I'm in my mid-30s now, otherwise healthy. However, I still fear death. Maybe I'm looking for something to take away this fear. Well, they used to say that the samurai would go and train in Zen monasteries to overcome their fear of death. And Buddhist practice really does help you to overcome your fear of death. It's true. But that's not the main question here. The main question is, do you think that Buddhism in the West mainly attracts people who have health or mental problems? Well, not necessarily. I do think that because Buddhism isn't mainstream, you're going to get attract a lot of people who don't follow the mainstream, which is going to include more people that are kind of on the fringe psychologically. So you're going to get quite a few nutty people attracted to Buddhism. You know, nonconformists at the very least, eccentrics and so forth. You know, they're more likely to be Buddhists in a non-Buddhist culture, just because you're going to have nonconformists becoming Buddhists, because the conformists will follow Christianity or just scientific materialism or whatever. With regard to health problems, like physical health problems, I'm unaware of people with physical health problems being more attracted to Buddhism, because every religion has its way of dealing with physical health problems. If I had physical health problems, I might be more attracted to something like Christian Science. So I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is from Sjors, S-J-O-R-S. Sounds Scandinavian. And Sjors, I think, says, regarding that part where Panyo says that the Hindu-Buddhist heavens are like celestial versions of Indian palaces in Shakyamuni's time, one view would be to claim that these realms don't exist, that they're products of their culture projecting their values into the afterlife. Another would be to say that they exist, aren't exactly like that, but were so described to Indians as a skillful means. Another still that they exist, are exactly like that, and even non-Indian converts will wind up in a very Indian-coded heaven after they die. Some would find it odd that people living on a different planet in a different kalpa, for instance, would be reborn in a heaven resembling Iron Age India, or a heavenly Jerusalem, or any earthbound culturally specific heaven for that matter. A fourth, I think, possible view would be the heavens exist but don't have a definite form. They are rather constructed by the collective karma of the aspirants and resemble that to which they aspire to. Thus, Indian heaven would appear Indian, etc. They are real places as far as real goes in samsara to those born there, not solipsistic dreams. Their form is stable, cannot be changed at will, like a lucid dream, as the devas delighting in their creations might be able to do in their own realms, and exist for a very long time. I think Swedenborg has a similar account. It's all speculation, but we're talking about sex in heaven after all. Anyway, what do you think? Question mark. There's a question mark at the end there. So that makes it a question for this video. And this was under the Sex in Heaven video that I did a little while ago with Brian Rue. This is Brian Rue wanted something clickbaity to attract people to Buddhism, so he's talking about the magnificent sex in the lower heaven realms. But with regard to his four possibilities here, I think 2 and 4 are likely. So his second possibility is that these heaven realms exist, aren't exactly like the way they are described, but were so described to Indians as a skillful means. And then, or just their best guess, really. And then his fourth one was that the heavens exist but don't have a definite form, but they are rather constructed by the collective karma of the aspirants and resemble that to which they aspire to. Yeah, I think both of those are probably interacting. So because we're already well over 2 hours here, I'm going to try and be a little more concise and try not to ramble so much. We'll have a drink of milk every now and then. And now we've got Hey, it's Tig, who is a wise guy, and he asks kind of jokey kind of questions sometimes. And Hey, it's Tig says, do you like pizza? What kind of pizza do you prefer? Do you prefer thick crust or thin crust pizza? Do you think pizza has appreciably changed since your childhood? Also, do you think that beer is the best accompanying #beverage to pizza? I certainly do so. So yeah, I like pizza. I think almost everybody likes pizza. I think the only person I ever met that really didn't like pizza was my father, who said he didn't like oregano. And it is true that I used to work on Japanese ships a long time ago, and they considered pizza to be girly food, that it was sort of considered to be unmacho for a Japanese man to eat pizza at the time. This is like back in the 1980s. So what kind of pizza do I prefer? Black olive and onion. And do you prefer thick crust or thin crust pizza? Either one. I can accept either way. Maybe I probably kind of go more towards the thick crust variety. And do I think pizza has appreciably changed since my childhood? Not that I have noticed. Also, I think there's maybe more variety, but that's about it. I mean, when you're a kid, it's like pepperoni. Also, do you think that beer is the best accompanying hashtag beverage to pizza? I certainly do so. Not necessarily. I don't necessarily. I think sometimes you just want to drink milk, you know? Or maybe a nice apple cider, for example. So I'll just move on to the next question from Stevens, who I think was following up on Hey, It's Tig, because Stevens says, how about Pizza Hut? Do you like Pizza Hut? If so, what is your favorite crust that they have? I used to work for Pizza Hut 20 years ago. How do you think Pizza Hut compares to its competition in the 80s and 90s up until today? Do you ever dine in one of actual dine-in huts before Yum Brands downsized Pizza Hut? Does anyone ever give pizza delivery as alms food? Well, the thing is, my mind was poisoned against Pizza Hut back in the 1980s, like the late 80s, because there was this other pizza franchise called Pizza Haven, and they had good pizza there. And it was, they had good commercials too. It was like, have a pizza craving? Go to Pizza Haven. Pizza Haven is pizza heaven, it'd be the guy crawling on his hands and knees through the desert going, pizza, pizza. It was good commercials, good pizza, and then they got bought out by Pizza Hut. And then all of a sudden, they had like this spongy, oily crust, and their sauce tasted like ketchup. So I've never liked Pizza Hut since then. I've never voluntarily made any effort to get Pizza Hut pizza ever since then. Ever since they betrayed me by buying out Pizza Haven, which was better pizza. And then they all turned into greasy, spongy crust with ketchup sauce. So I don't know what kind of crusts they have or anything like that. And if you used to work for Pizza Hut 20 years ago, I'm sure that you're still a good person. And I don't know how they compare with the competition. Personally, I'd rather go Papa John's or something. And did I ever dine in one of the actual dine-in huts? No, I never did. And here we go. Does anyone ever give pizza delivery as alms food? And yes, when I was a monk in California, several times I got pizza. Like somebody wanted to offer alms food, but they live hundreds of miles away. So what they would do is they would call a pizza place near my monastery and have a pizza delivered in the morning, and then I would eat it. So yeah, I got pictures of me with. I got one picture especially. This guy donated a pizza to me, and it shows me I'm holding it, and I had another monk take my picture holding the pizza so I could send him the picture and saying, see, I got your pizza and I ate it and it was good. And I even got pizza occasionally in Asia, although the Asians, as a general rule, they really do not have a firm grasp on the concept of pizza. Similarly with bread in general, they really don't understand bread. Like Japanese pizzas that I ate on the ships, they had like seaweed on them and stuff. And yeah, it's like I remember in Burma, you get little packets of ketchup with your pizza, and it was like cardboard crust. It was really awful. So, but yeah, sometimes people do give pizza delivery as alms food. So I'll just move on to the very last question. This is weird. It takes me by surprise. So yeah, this isn't going to be a 3-hour long video because boom, we're at the very last question. And this is from Mikubo, who is a recent joiner of the Discord server and a recent joiner of the Subscribe channel too. So salute. And Mikubo says, do you think the samsara nirvana distinction is analogous to Kant's concept of phenomenon and noumenon? Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of analogy that could be brought between the two. Like I think Kant's conception of, the thing as it seems and the thing in itself are really close to the Buddhist conception of conventional truth and ultimate truth. So ultimate truth is the only real truth. And that's, in my opinion, Nirvana, Nibbana. Although from the orthodox position, that would be like the Abhidhamma philosophy. And then conventional truth is just Vihara, like Vihara Desana. Just you just talk as though samsara were real because you're just in samsara and you don't have much choice. And so, yeah, Kant's conception of phenomenon and noumenon would be like the Buddhist conception of conventional truth and ultimate truth, which to me is like samsara and nirvana. Although in Orthodox Buddhism, samsara is ultimately real, is just as ultimately real as Nibbana is. According to like the Abhidhamma philosophy and the commentarial tradition, samsara is ultimately real. These individual atoms of matter and mind are ultimately real, just as real as Nibbana is. And that's one reason why I just cannot take the Orthodox, like Abhidhamma philosophy and the commentarial tradition very seriously, because I just don't buy it. I do not think that multiplicity is ultimately real, or that physical matter, just absolutely distinct from mind, just qualitatively different from mind, just totally different. Not just two aspects of the same thing like Spinoza taught, but mind and matter are just completely different, completely distinct, and ultimately real. That is what Orthodox Theravada teaches, and I just cannot buy it. I just do not swallow it. So my comparison of samsara and nirvana would be very close to Kant's conception of the phenomenon and the noumenon, but the Orthodox Theravada position wouldn't be the same. So I guess that's it. I did it. By golly. Take my last sip of milk as a reward. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Be as inquisitive as you please, although please don't ask more than 6 questions per video, because as you can see, the lists, I mean, there was lots of questions here. And feel free to leave your questions in the comments below, or if you have access to the Discord server or Subscribestar, you can leave them there. Anything you think I'd be in a position to answer, although remember, I am not well versed in Satanism or Pizza Hut. So you may want to ask somebody else questions about those. And like and subscribe. Feel free to look at the URL links and check them out, including my books, and be happy.